Marcus Thornwell had always considered himself intellectually superior to the average human. As a self-proclaimed enhanced being who'd spent years studying martial arts videos on YouTube and reading philosophical treatises about combat, he believed he had transcended the limitations of ordinary mortals. This delusion would prove to be his most expensive mistake yet. It all started on a Tuesday evening at Murphy's Tavern, where Marcus sat nursing his third craft beer and holding court with anyone unfortunate enough to be within earshot. The topic, as it often was with Marcus, centered on humanity's inherent weakness and his own supposed superiority. You see, he proclaimed to the bartender, who was clearly regretting not calling in sick, humans are fundamentally flawed creatures. They rely too heavily on emotion, on instinct. A truly evolved being like myself operates on pure logic and calculated precision. At the end of the bar sat Jake Morrison, a quiet man in his 40s who worked construction and had stopped in for a single beer after his shift. Jake had been trying to ignore Marcus's pontificating, but the volume kept increasing, and the nonsense had reached unbearable levels. Humans, Marcus continued, now standing and gesturing wildly, are nothing more than barely controlled animals. With proper training and mental discipline, someone like me could easily overcome any of their primitive responses. Jake finally looked up from his beer. Is that so? Marcus turned toward the voice, sizing up the speaker. Jake was stocky but not particularly tall, with calloused hands and the kind of quiet demeanor that Marcus mistook for weakness. Perfect. Absolutely, Marcus replied, puffing out his chest. Take you, for example. I can tell just by looking that you're operating on pure biological programming. Fight or flight responses, testosterone-driven aggression, the whole primitive package. Jake took a slow sip of his beer. And you're different? Completely. I've spent years mastering the art of combat through mental discipline and strategic study. I could demonstrate the superiority of intellect over brute force using you as an example, if you're willing. The bar had gone quiet. Even the jukebox seemed to sense the tension and had stopped between songs. Jake set down his beer and turned to face Marcus fully. You want to fight me? Marcus straightened his shoulders, trying to look imposing in his designer cardigan and perfectly pressed khakis. I'm challenging you to combat, yes. Not a barbaric brawl, but a demonstration of evolved technique versus primitive instinct. Jake studied him for a long moment. You sure about this? Absolutely certain. What Marcus didn't know was that Jake Morrison had spent 12 years in the Marines, including 3 tours in Afghanistan. He'd trained in multiple martial arts since he was 8 years old, not from YouTube videos but in actual dojos under masters who demanded blood, sweat, and humility. He'd also worked construction for the past decade, which meant his body was a carefully honed instrument of practical strength. But Jake was also a fundamentally decent person who didn't believe in unnecessary violence. He tried one more time. Look, friend, I think you might want to reconsider this. Why don't we just... Are you afraid? Marcus interrupted, mistaking Jake's restraint for cowardice. I understand if you're intimidated. Not everyone can handle facing a superior opponent. Jake sighed and stood up. He was 3 inches shorter than Marcus but somehow seemed to fill more space. All right. But we do this outside, and we stop when one of us says stop. The small crowd from the bar followed them to the parking lot, where Marcus began what he believed was an intimidating display of shadow boxing and martial arts poses he'd memorized from movies. He threw a few practice kicks, executed some elaborate hand movements, and even did a little bow that he thought looked profound and mysterious. Jake just stood there, hands at his sides, looking tired. Whenever you're ready, Jake said quietly. Marcus launched himself forward with what he imagined was lightning speed and deadly precision. He'd planned the perfect combination, a feint to the left, a spinning kick to disorient his opponent, followed by a pressure point strike he'd seen in a documentary about ninjas. He executed exactly none of these moves. Instead, Jake stepped slightly to the right, caught Marcus's wildly telegraphed punch with embarrassing ease, and used Marcus's own momentum to introduce him to the asphalt with a simple hip toss that would have made his 8th-grade wrestling coach proud. Marcus hit the ground hard, his perfect plan crumbling along with what he suspected might be his collarbone. But his ego was still intact, and ego is a dangerous thing. Lucky shot, he gasped, struggling to his feet. I wasn't ready. Jake stepped back, giving him space. We can call it done right here. But Marcus, bleeding from his nose and with his cardigan torn, couldn't let it go. He charged again, this time attempting what he believed was a devastating tackle that would showcase his intellectual approach to leverage and body mechanics. Jake sidestepped like a matador, avoiding a particularly slow and confused bull. Marcus ran face-first into the side of a pickup truck, which proved significantly less forgiving than Jake had been. Now, 3 days later, Marcus lay in his hospital bed, pecking out this account on his phone with his one working hand. His face looked like he'd argued with a blender and lost. His ribs were cracked, his nose was broken, his left arm was in a cast, and his ego was in approximately 17 pieces. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, though that was considerable. It wasn't even the medical bills, though those were mounting faster than his previous delusions of grandeur. The worst part was the slow, dawning realization that he had fundamentally misunderstood everything about combat, about humans, and about himself. Jake had visited him yesterday, bringing flowers and an apology that Marcus definitely didn't deserve. They'd talked for an hour about real martial arts, about discipline and respect, about the difference between knowing something intellectually and understanding it in your bones. The strongest people I've ever known, Jake had said, were the ones who never had to prove it to anyone. Marcus closed his eyes and listened to the steady beep of the heart monitor. Tomorrow, the physical therapist would begin the long process of rebuilding his body. But tonight, lying alone with his thoughts and his mistakes, Marcus realized that the much harder work would be rebuilding his understanding of what it truly meant to be human. He deleted the social media posts about his intellectual superiority. He canceled his order for the black belt he'd bought online. And he began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there might be something to learn about strength from the very humans he'd so foolishly dismissed.